carriage wheel cracked against a stone, and Alara Whitmore gripped the edge of her seat as Edmund Voss shot her a look so cold that she stopped breathing for a moment. He had not spoken a single word since they left the house, and the silence inside the carriage felt heavier than any shout could have been. Alara was 11 years old, small for her age, with dark hair tied back in a plain ribbon her mother had given her the winter before. She did not know where they were going. She only knew that something about this journey was wrong, and that the man sitting across from her, the man her mother had married 2 years ago, wanted nothing to do with her. Edmund had not always looked at her this way. When he first came into their lives, he had smiled at Alara, brought her small sweets from the market, and spoken kindly to her mother, Miriam, in a voice that seemed to promise safety after years of hardship. Miriam had been a widow then, raising Alara alone after her first husband, a quiet carpenter named Henry Whitmore, died from a fever when Alara was barely 6. Those years without a father had been difficult, filled with worry over rent and food, and when Edmund arrived, offering steady work and a comfortable home, Miriam had believed her prayers had finally been answered. For a while, it seemed she was right. Edmund ran a modest trading business, buying goods from northern merchants and selling them in the city markets. He kept a respectable house, with a garden Miriam loved to tend, and he treated Alara with enough warmth that the girl slowly let her guard down. She began calling him nothing more than his name, never father, but she no longer flinched when he entered a room. She believed, as children often do, that kindness once given would remain. But warmth, as Alara would later understand, is not the same as love. Edmund's kindness had been a mask worn for Miriam's sake, a performance meant to secure the comfortable life her small inheritance and modest property could provide him. Once the marriage was settled and the property was legally his to manage, the mask began to slip, slowly at first, then faster than anyone could stop. It started with small things. A sharper tone when Alara asked a question at dinner. A door closed a little too firmly when she lingered near his study. Miriam noticed these changes too, but she loved her husband and told herself he was simply tired, that business worries weighed on him, that things would soften again once the harvest season passed and money came easier. She did not want to see what was forming in front of her, because to see it clearly would mean admitting she had made a mistake that could not easily be undone. Alara noticed more than her mother did, because children often notice what adults choose to ignore. She noticed that Edmund's eyes lingered on her a moment too long whenever she laughed too freely at the table, as if her happiness annoyed him. She noticed that he never called her by name if he could avoid it, using instead a flat, dismissive "you" or "the girl" when speaking to servants about her. She noticed that when her mother was not in the room, his voice lost every trace of gentleness, turning clipped and impatient, sometimes cruel in ways too quiet for anyone else to catch. One evening, not long before the carriage ride that would change everything, Alara sat alone in the garden her mother had planted years earlier. The roses were beginning to wilt with the coming of autumn, and she liked to sit among them anyway, tracing the curled edges of the fading petals with her fingers. It was there that she overheard Edmund speaking with a merchant friend near the garden wall. Their voices carried on the evening air. "She is not mine," Edmund said, in a tone Alara had never heard him use before, sharp and bitter. "I did not marry that woman for a child who reminds her of a dead man every time she opens her mouth." The merchant laughed, a short, unkind sound. "Then why keep her?" "Because for now, it suits me to look respectable," Edmund answered, "but respectability has its limits." Alara sat frozen among the roses, her small hands pressed flat against the cool soil, her heart pounding so loudly she feared they might hear it. She did not fully understand every word, but she understood enough. She understood that the man who shared her family's table did not see her as family at all. She understood that whatever safety she had believed herself to have was thinner than she had ever imagined. She did not tell her mother what she had heard. She was afraid, in the confused way children often are, that speaking the truth aloud might make it more real, or that her mother would not believe her, or worse, that her mother would believe her and be hurt beyond repair. So Alara carried the secret alone, folding it away like a stone she swallowed and could not spit back out. In the weeks that followed, Miriam's health began to decline. It started with a persistent cough that would not clear, then a weariness that kept her in bed longer each morning. The town physician, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Aldous Fenwick, visited twice, prescribing rest and warm broths, expressing quiet concern that never quite turned into alarm, at least not aloud. Elara took to sitting by her mother's bedside in the evenings, reading to her from a worn book of old stories, watching the candle flame flicker against the walls, while her mother's breathing grew shallower with each passing week. Edmund, meanwhile, grew more distant. He spent longer hours away from the house, claiming business troubles that kept him traveling to distant towns. When he returned, he smelled of unfamiliar taverns and carried a restless, hungry look in his eyes that Elara had learned to avoid. She kept to her room more often now, venturing out mainly to tend to her mother, or to slip into the garden when the house felt too heavy to bear. One cold evening, Elara was returning from the well with a bucket of water when she passed by Edmund's study and heard him speaking urgently to a man she did not recognize, his voice low and strained in a way she had not heard before. "I cannot pay it by the week's end," Edmund was saying. "You must give me more time." "Time is not something I deal in," the stranger replied. "Coin is." Elara hurried past, water sloshing over the rim of the bucket, her mind spinning with questions she dared not ask. She did not yet understand the full weight of debt or gambling, or the slow collapse of a business built on borrowed confidence rather than steady skill. She only understood that something in their household was crumbling beneath the surface, invisible to the eye, but growing heavier with every passing day, like ice thickening over a pond that looked calm from a distance. Her mother's illness deepened as autumn turned toward winter. Miriam could no longer rise from her bed most mornings, and her voice, once warm and full of gentle humor, grew thin and faint. Elara spent every spare hour at her side, holding her hand, brushing her hair, whispering small comforts she was not certain she believed herself. She watched her mother's eyes, once so lively, grow distant and unfocused, fixed on some point beyond the ceiling that Elara could not see. "You are strong, my Elara," Miriam whispered one evening, her fingers weakly tightening around her daughter's hand. "Stronger than you know. Whatever happens, you must remember that." Elara did not understand then why her mother spoke such words with such urgency, why there was a tremble beneath them that felt like both comfort and warning at once. She only nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, and promised to remember, though she could not have guessed how soon and how harshly that promise would be tested. Edmund rarely visited the sick room. When he did, his presence felt like a cold draft slipping beneath a door, brief and unwelcome. He would stand at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, and ask brief questions about medicine and cost, rather than comfort or care. Elara began to notice, with a child's sharp instinct for truth beneath performance, that he seemed to be waiting for something, though she could not name what. It was on one such evening, as Elara sat combing her mother's thinning hair by candlelight, that she caught Edmund watching her from the doorway, with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. It was not anger, nor was it the practiced kindness of earlier years. It was something colder, a calculating stillness, as though he were looking not at a grieving child, but at a problem waiting to be solved. Elara held his gaze for only a moment before looking away, a chill settling deep into her chest that had nothing to do with the season's cold. She did not know it then, but that look was the beginning of the end of whatever fragile safety remained in her life. The mask Edmund had worn since his first days in their home was nearly gone now, worn through by debt, resentment, and the slow realization that the woman who had bound him to this family was slipping away, taking with her the one reason he had ever bothered to pretend at kindness. Elara returned her attention to her mother's hair, guiding the comb gently through the fragile strands, humming softly the tune her mother used to hum to her when she was very small. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the first true bite of winter. Elara did not know what waited beyond the walls of that house in the weeks to come. She only knew, with the quiet certainty children sometimes carry long before adults admit the same truths, that the storm gathering around her family was far from finished, and that whatever came next, she would likely have to face it alone. There was a woman in the house named Greta, an older servant who had worked for Miriam since before Edmund's arrival, and who had grown fond of Elara in a quiet, steady way that needed no words to prove itself. Greta often slipped Elara small pieces of bread with honey when the kitchen was empty, and in the evenings, when Miriam slept and Edmund was away at whatever business kept him from home, Greta would sit with Elara near the hearth and tell her old stories from her own childhood in a village far to the north, stories filled with clever foxes and patient rivers and children who found their way home, no matter how far they wandered. "The world is not always kind, little one," Greta told her one such evening, her weathered hands busy mending a torn hem. "But it is not only cruel either. Somewhere along every hard road, there is usually a door that opens when you least expect it. You must only have the courage to keep walking until you find it." Alara held on to those words more tightly than she let on, turning them over in her mind during the long hours she spent watching her mother's chest rise and fall with increasing effort. She did not yet understand how soon she would need that courage, nor how literal a hard road would become in the weeks ahead. Edmund's business troubles did not stay hidden for long, despite his efforts to keep them from Miriam's ears. Word traveled through the small circles of tradesmen and merchants who once respected him. Whispers of unpaid debts and broken promises, of a man who had borrowed heavily against goods that never arrived, and contracts that fell through at the worst possible moments. Alara overheard fragments of these rumors when she accompanied Greta to the market, catching sideways glances and lowered voices whenever Edmund's name came up among the stalls. One afternoon, a tall man in a dark coat came to the house, demanding to speak with Edmund immediately. Alara, peering from the top of the stairs, watched as the man's voice rose sharply in the front hall, accusing Edmund of breaking an agreement that had cost the man a considerable sum. Edmund's replies were quiet, placating, entirely unlike the confident merchant who had once charmed Miriam with easy promises. When the man finally left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, Edmund stood alone in the hall for a long moment, his shoulders sagging in a way Alara had never seen before. Then he noticed her watching from above, and his expression hardened instantly, transforming from weary defeat into something sharper and more dangerous. "What are you looking at?" he snapped, his voice carrying an edge that made her flinch and retreat quickly to her room. That night, Alara lay awake, listening to the murmur of voices below, Edmund and Miriam speaking in the sitting room, in tones too low for her to make out clearly. She caught only fragments, her mother's voice weak but insistent, Edmund's voice tight with barely controlled frustration. She could not know exactly what passed between them, but she sensed, with the same instinct that had warned her weeks before in the garden, that whatever fragile peace remained in their household was fraying past repair. The days grew shorter as winter approached in earnest. Frost crept across the window panes each morning, and the garden Miriam had once tended so lovingly stood bare and brittle, the roses long since cut back for the cold season. Alara took over small chores that Greta could not manage alone, fetching water, feeding the modest fire that warmed her mother's room, doing what little she could to ease the household's burden, even as she felt increasingly like a shadow moving through rooms that no longer welcomed her. Miriam had good days and bad days during this time, moments of lucidity when she would ask Alara to read to her from favorite passages, her eyes brightening briefly with the old warmth Alara remembered from before the illness took hold. On those days, Alara allowed herself small flickers of hope, imagining a future where her mother recovered fully, where the coldness in the house might thaw alongside the frost outside. But the bad days came more frequently than the good ones, and each time Miriam's strength ebbed a little further, Alara felt the ground beneath her growing thinner and more uncertain. It was during one of these difficult stretches that Alara first noticed Edmund speaking privately with a lawyer who visited the house under the pretense of discussing property matters. She caught only glimpses of the conversation through a partially closed door, papers spread across Edmund's desk, phrases about inheritance and guardianship exchanged in careful, deliberate tones. She did not fully understand what she was witnessing, but a cold unease settled over her that she could not shake, a sense that decisions were being made about her life, without her knowledge or consent, decisions that might not favor her at all. She considered, more than once, running to her mother's bedside to share what she had overheard, both in the garden weeks earlier, and now with the lawyer. But each time she reached the door of her mother's room, she hesitated, watching Miriam's frail form beneath the blankets, her labored breathing, and could not bring herself to add worry to a woman who already carried so much. Instead, Alara carried the weight alone, a habit that was quickly becoming second nature, though it left her feeling increasingly isolated within the walls of the only home she had ever known. Greta noticed the change in her, the quietness that had crept into Alara's manner, where once there had been a child's natural curiosity and chatter. On a particularly bleak evening, as wind howled outside and the fire crackled low in the hearth, Greta pulled Alara close and simply held her for a long moment without speaking, offering the kind of comfort that needed no explanation. "Whatever comes," Greta finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You remember that you are not alone in this world, even when it feels that way. There are always more people who care than the ones who show it loudest." Alara clung to those words in the days that followed, even as the atmosphere in the house grew heavier, thick with unspoken tension, and the sense of something inevitable drawing closer. She began to notice Edmund watching her more often, his expression unreadable, calculating in a way that made her skin prickle with unease whenever their eyes happened to meet across a room. She did not yet know what he was planning, but she understood, in the quiet and frightened way children often understand danger before adults name it aloud, that whatever it was, it would not be gentle, and it would not consider her well-being at all. As the first heavy snow of the season began to fall outside her window one evening, Alara pressed her small hand against the cold glass and watched the flakes drift down in the darkening light. Somewhere below, she could hear Edmund's voice, low and urgent, speaking with someone she did not recognize, the words indistinct, but the tone unmistakably tense. She did not know that this conversation, more than any before it, was setting into motion the events that would soon tear her away from everything familiar and leave her facing a cold far more literal and far more dangerous than anything she had yet experienced. She only knew, watching the snow fall silently over the darkened garden, that winter had truly arrived, and that whatever warmth remained in her small world was fading fast, like the last embers of a dying fire. Miriam died on a Tuesday morning, just as pale winter light was beginning to creep through the frost-covered window of her room. Alara had fallen asleep in the chair beside her mother's bed sometime after midnight, exhausted from days of little rest, and when she woke to the sound of Greta's soft, broken voice calling her name, she knew, before she even opened her eyes, that something irreversible had happened. Her mother's hand, which Alara had been holding through the night, had gone still and cool beneath her fingers. The room was silent, except for Greta's quiet weeping and the distant creak of the house settling in the cold. Alara did not cry at first. She simply sat there, staring at her mother's peaceful face, waiting for some sign that this was a mistake, that Miriam would stir and open her eyes and ask for water, or a story, or simply reach out to smooth Alara's hair the way she always had. But no such sign came. The stillness in the room was absolute, final, and it took several long minutes before the truth settled fully into Alara's chest. And when it did, the grief arrived all at once, an overwhelming wave that left her gasping and clinging to Greta's arms as the older woman held her close. Word spread through the household quickly. Edmund arrived within the hour, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling sorrow, though Alara, even through her own grief, noticed how quickly his eyes moved past his wife's body to survey the room, as though already calculating what needed to be done next. He spoke briefly with Dr. Fenwick, who had been summoned, though there was nothing left for him to do, and then retreated to his study without a single word offered to Alara, without so much as a glance in her direction. The funeral was held 3 days later, a modest affair attended by a handful of neighbors, a few of Miriam's distant relatives, and the small circle of tradespeople who had known her over the years. Alara stood at the graveside, in a borrowed black dress that hung loosely on her thin frame, Greta's steadying hand on her shoulder, the only thing keeping her upright, as the priest spoke words she barely absorbed. She watched the plain wooden coffin lowered into the frozen ground, and felt something inside her close like a door swinging shut, sealing away the last remaining warmth of her childhood. Edmund stood apart from the small gathering, his hands clasped behind his back, his face arranged in an expression of appropriate solemnity that nonetheless failed to reach his eyes. Several of the mourners exchanged quiet glances during the service, whispers passing between them that Alara caught only in fragments. She heard mention of the estate, of debts, of questions about what would become of the property now that Miriam was gone. She did not fully understand the implications of these whispered conversations, but she sensed, with the same instinctive dread that had haunted her for weeks, that her own future was being discussed and decided without any consideration for what she might want or need. After the funeral, the house felt different in ways Alara could not quite articulate. Colder not just in temperature, but in some essential quality that had once made it feel like home. Miriam's absence was everywhere. In the empty chair by the window where she used to sit with her needlework, in the garden now buried under snow, in the silence that had replaced her gentle humming that once drifted through the halls. Ilara moved through these rooms like a ghost herself, uncertain of her place in a household that had never truly welcomed her, and now had even less reason to pretend otherwise. Edmund's behavior shifted almost immediately following the burial. Where before he had maintained at least a thin veneer of civility for Miriam's sake, that pretense evaporated within days of her death. He began speaking to Ilara only when necessary, his tone clipped and impatient, treating her less like a member of the household and more like an unwanted guest who had overstayed her welcome. Meals became tense, silent affairs, Edmund eating quickly and retreating to his study, leaving Ilara to eat alone in the kitchen with Greta, who did her best to fill the silence with gentle conversation that could not fully mask the growing unease in the house. One evening, roughly a week after the funeral, Ilara overheard Edmund in his study, speaking with the same lawyer who had visited before her mother's death. This time, she made no effort to pretend she was simply passing by. She pressed herself against the wall outside the door, straining to catch every word, driven by a desperate need to understand what was being decided about her future. The property was Miriam's, the lawyer was saying, but under the terms of the marriage, it passes to you as her husband. The girl has no legal claim to it. And her guardianship? Edmund asked, his voice carrying a note of impatience that made Ilara's stomach tighten with dread. You are her legal guardian now, as her stepfather, unless other arrangements are made, the lawyer replied. Though I should note, sir, that guardianship carries certain responsibilities. The girl must be cared for, educated, provided for, until she comes of age, or until other arrangements can be made. There was a long pause before Edmund spoke again, and when he did, his voice had dropped to something quieter, more calculating. And if other arrangements were made? If she were, say, sent to live with distant relatives, or placed in the care of some charitable institution, that would be within your rights as guardian, the lawyer answered carefully, provided proper arrangements were documented, and the girl's basic welfare was accounted for on paper, at least. Ilara felt her blood turn to ice at these words, understanding now with terrible clarity the direction of her stepfather's thoughts. She was not being considered as a daughter to be raised and loved, but as a burden to be transferred, a problem to be solved through whatever means proved most convenient. She backed away from the door slowly, her legs trembling, and fled to her room, where she sat on her narrow bed hugging her knees to her chest, trying to process the enormity of what she had just heard. She did not sleep well that night, nor for many nights afterward. Every creak of the house, every distant murmur of Edmund's voice from below, sent fresh waves of anxiety through her small frame. She began watching him more closely, noting his movements, his conversations with visitors who came and went from the house with increasing frequency. Men in fine coats, who spoke of money and contracts and debts, in tones that grew progressively more urgent with each passing week. Greta, sensing the shift in the household's atmosphere, though not privy to the exact conversation Ilara had overheard, grew increasingly protective of the girl, keeping her close whenever possible, teaching her small practical skills, how to mend a torn hem, how to bake simple bread, how to read the weather by watching the clouds gather over the distant hills. It was as though the older woman sensed, without being told, that Ilara might soon need to rely on her own resourcefulness in ways no child should have to. You have your mother's strength in you, Greta told her one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen, kneading dough with flour-dusted hands. She was strong, too, in her own quiet way. Sometimes strength does not look like shouting or fighting. Sometimes it looks like simply enduring, and finding small moments of light, even in the darkest times. Ilara absorbed these lessons hungrily, sensing that they might prove more valuable than any of the formal education Edmund had grudgingly continued to provide, more out of appearances than genuine concern for her development. She spent her evenings now not lost in childish daydreams but planning, in whatever small ways an 11-year-old girl could plan, for a future she suspected would soon look very different from anything she had known. The weeks following her mother's death blurred together in a haze of grief and growing dread. Edmund's business troubles, rather than easing, seemed to worsen with each passing month. Ilara caught glimpses of unpaid bills left carelessly on his desk, overheard fragments of increasingly desperate conversations with creditors, noticed the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching, a man clearly drowning under pressures he could no longer control. She might have felt some flicker of sympathy for him under different circumstances, but his continued coldness toward her, his obvious resentment at her very presence in his household, left little room for such feelings to take root. One night, unable to sleep, Ilara crept down to the kitchen for a cup of water and found Edmund sitting alone at the table, a bottle of dark liquid before him, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, something almost human flickered across his features, a weariness so profound, it briefly softened the hard lines of his face. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the familiar coldness that had become his default expression whenever he looked at her. "Go back to bed," he said, his words slightly slurred. "There is nothing here for you to see." Ilara retreated without a word, her heart pounding, understanding on some deep level that whatever fragile control Edmund had maintained over his circumstances was slipping further away with each passing day, and that when it finally collapsed entirely, she would likely bear the consequences of decisions made not out of malice alone, but out of desperation, greed, and a complete absence of any genuine care for her well-being. The house that had once, briefly, felt like a refuge, now felt like a place suspended on the edge of some terrible precipice, waiting only for the final push that would send everything crashing down. She thought often, in those long sleepless nights, of her mother's final words to her, the quiet insistence that she was stronger than she knew. She clung to those words now more than ever, sensing that whatever trial lay ahead, she would need every ounce of that strength simply to survive it. As the winter deepened, the servants who had once filled the house with quiet activity began to disappear, one by one. First it was the stable hand, a young man named Peter, who had always greeted Ilara with a friendly wave whenever she passed the barn. Edmund dismissed him abruptly one morning, citing costs that could no longer be justified, though Ilara suspected the truth had more to do with Peter's open sympathy toward her, a sympathy Edmund seemed increasingly unwilling to tolerate from anyone in his employ. Next came the cook, an older woman named Agnes, who had prepared meals for the household for over a decade. She left in tears, embracing Ilara tightly before she departed, whispering that she wished circumstances were different, that she would remember the girl fondly, wherever life took her next. Ilara watched her walk down the frozen path away from the house, her small bundle of belongings clutched to her chest, and felt another piece of her fragile world crumble away. Only Greta remained, and Ilara suspected this was less due to any lingering sentiment on Edmund's part, and more because Greta's wages were modest enough that dismissing her would save little money, while her domestic skills remained useful for maintaining at least a semblance of order in the household. Still, Ilara noticed Edmund's eyes narrowing whenever he observed Greta's evident affection for her, and she began to fear that even this last connection might soon be severed. The isolation grew heavier with each passing week. Ilara no longer attended the small local school she had once visited a few times weekly, Edmund declaring the expense unnecessary, given the family's tightening finances. Instead, she spent her days confined largely to the house, venturing outside only for brief walks in the snow-covered garden or to help Greta with whatever chores needed attending. She missed the company of other children, missed the small kindnesses of neighbors who had once smiled at her in passing, missed anything resembling the normal rhythms of a childhood that felt increasingly like a distant memory, rather than her actual life. Edmund's visitors continued to arrive with troubling regularity, men whose faces grew increasingly hard, whose voices carried less patience with each visit. Ilara learned to recognize the sound of raised voices from behind the study door, the particular creak of the front gate that signaled another creditor arriving, to demand payment on debts Edmund seemed increasingly unable to satisfy. She began to understand, in the practical way children sometimes grasp adult troubles without fully comprehending their complexities, that her stepfather's financial situation had moved beyond mere difficulty into something approaching genuine crisis. One particularly harsh evening, a man arrived at the house in a state of open anger, his voice booming through the halls loud enough that even Greta, in the kitchen, paused her work to listen with evident concern. Ilara crept partway down the stairs, drawn by both fear and an irresistible need to understand the full scope of the danger surrounding her. "You have had months, Voss," the man was shouting. "Months, and still nothing. My patience has limits, and you have exhausted them entirely." "I need only a little more time," Edmund pleaded, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance, reduced to something almost desperate. "The spring shipments will bring enough to settle everything, I swear it." You swore that last season as well, the man snapped. I begin to wonder if you have any intention of honoring your debts at all, or if you simply intend to hide behind excuses until I am forced to take more drastic measures. The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, threats and pleas exchanged with increasing intensity, until finally the visitor stormed out, slamming the door hard enough that the windows rattled in their frames. Alara retreated quickly to her room, before Edmund could discover she had been listening, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just heard. Whatever debts Edmund owed, they were clearly far beyond his capacity to repay, and the men he owed them to were growing increasingly impatient, increasingly willing to consider actions beyond simple demands for payment. She wondered, in the quiet darkness of her room that night, what such drastic measures might entail, and whether they might somehow involve her, given her stepfather's earlier conversations about guardianship and the possibility of arranging for her to live elsewhere. The thought terrified her, not because she felt any particular attachment to the house or to Edmund himself, but because the uncertainty of what might come next, the complete lack of control she had over her own fate, left her feeling perpetually on edge, as though she were standing on ice that might crack beneath her at any moment without warning. Greta noticed her growing anxiety and did what she could to offer comfort, though even she seemed increasingly aware that the situation in the household was deteriorating beyond her ability to shield the girl from its consequences. On quiet evenings, when Edmund was away meeting with creditors or drowning his troubles in drink at some distant tavern, Greta would sit with Alara by the kitchen fire and share stories of resilience, of people who had faced terrible hardships and found ways through them, planting seeds of hope that Alara desperately needed, even as the world around her grew darker. Your mother would be proud of how you have carried yourself through all this, Greta told her one such evening, her weathered face illuminated by the flickering firelight. Grief is a heavy thing to bear alone, especially for one so young, and yet you have borne it with more grace than many grown men I have known. Alara accepted the compliment quietly, though inside she felt anything but graceful, feeling instead perpetually frightened, uncertain, and increasingly aware that her position within the household grew more precarious with each passing day. She began, almost unconsciously, to prepare herself for the possibility that she might soon need to face whatever came next, entirely alone, without even Greta's steady presence to offer comfort and guidance. As the calendar turned toward the coldest part of winter, Edmund's demeanor shifted once more, becoming quieter, more withdrawn, though no less unsettling for the change. He spent long hours locked away in his study, and Alara occasionally glimpsed him through a partially opened door, staring at ledgers and letters with an expression of grim calculation that made her stomach twist with fresh unease. She sensed that some decision was forming in his mind, something that would soon set in motion consequences she could not yet fully anticipate, but which she instinctively understood would not favor her interests in any way whatsoever. She thought, during these long uncertain days, of running away, of finding some distant relative who might take her in, though she knew of none close enough to reach, and the practical realities of a young girl attempting such a journey alone in the depths of winter left the idea feeling more like a desperate fantasy than any genuine possibility. Instead, she waited, watching, listening, gathering whatever small pieces of information she could about the storm she sensed gathering ever closer, determined at the very least to face whatever came with her eyes open, refusing to be caught entirely by surprise when the final blow finally landed. The knock came just after dawn, hard and insistent, rattling the front door with a force that spoke of anger rather than mere impatience. Alara, already awake from another restless night, crept to the top of the stairs and watched as Edmund answered, his face draining of color the moment he saw who stood on the doorstep. 3 men entered without waiting for an invitation, their coats fine, but their expressions hard, and the tallest among them, a broad-shouldered man with a scar tracing his jaw, spoke in a voice that carried the weight of absolute finality. You had until this morning, Voss. We gave you every reasonable chance. Please, Edmund said, his composure cracking in a way Alara had never witnessed before. I only need a few more weeks. The northern shipment is delayed, not lost. Once it arrives, I can settle everything at once. You have said this before, the scarred man replied coldly. Excuses have stopped being useful to us. We will be taking possession of the warehouse stock as partial payment, and I suggest you find the remainder of what you owe very quickly. or the consequences will extend well beyond your inventory. The men moved through the house with business-like efficiency, cataloging items of value in the front rooms, examining furniture and silverware, with the practiced eye of those accustomed to seizing assets from failed debtors. Ilara watched from the shadows of the upper hallway, her heart pounding, understanding, with growing clarity, that whatever remained of her stepfather's business and reputation was collapsing entirely, and that the consequences of this collapse would inevitably reach into every corner of the household, including her own uncertain place within it. After the men departed, taking with them a wagon loaded with goods from Edmund's warehouse and a promise of further consequences should the remaining debt go unpaid, Edmund retreated to his study and did not emerge for the remainder of the day. Ilara found Greta in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared a simple meal that no one seemed inclined to eat. "This is bad, isn't it?" Ilara said quietly, not quite a question. Greta hesitated before answering, clearly weighing how much truth to share with a child, already burdened by more than her share of worry. "Your stepfather has made poor decisions with money that was never truly his to risk," she finally said. "I fear matters will grow more difficult before they improve, if they improve at all." Ilara absorbed this information with the strange calm that had become her default response to bad news over these past months, a numbness born of repeated exposure to circumstances beyond her control. She had long since stopped expecting reassurance or comfort from Edmund, and increasingly, she found herself preparing mentally for whatever hardship might come next, rehearsing in her mind different scenarios of what her future might hold, none of them particularly hopeful. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house grew almost unbearably tense. Edmund barely spoke, moving through the halls like a man haunted by ghosts only he could see, his eyes darting toward windows and doors, as though expecting further unwelcome visitors at any moment. He drank more heavily than before, and Ilara learned to recognize the particular unsteadiness of his gait that signaled she should stay well clear of his path, retreating to her room or the kitchen whenever she heard him approaching. One evening, roughly a week after the debt collector's visit, Ilara overheard a conversation that chilled her more deeply than any before it. Edmund was speaking again with the lawyer, their voices drifting from the study in tones far more urgent than any previous discussion. "I need to know precisely what obligations remain if the girl were no longer under my care," Edmund said, his voice tight with barely controlled desperation. "As I explained previously," the lawyer replied carefully, "your legal obligations as guardian would transfer to whoever assumed her care, provided proper documentation existed. However, sir, I must ask directly, what exactly are you considering?" There was a long pause before Edmund answered, and when he did, his voice had dropped to something Ilara could barely hear through the door. "I am considering every option available to a man in my position. A man drowning does not concern himself with elegance in how he reaches the surface." Ilara backed away from the door slowly, her entire body trembling, understanding now with a clarity that felt like ice water flooding through her veins, that Edmund was seriously contemplating abandoning his obligations toward her entirely, finding some way to remove her from his life and his diminishing resources without regard for what might happen to her as a result. She fled to her room and sat huddled on her bed for hours, staring at the frosted window, trying to imagine what shape such abandonment might take, and finding no comfort whatsoever in her imagination's darkest possibilities. She considered, in her desperation, confiding in Greta about what she had overheard, seeking some kind of protection or plan from the one adult in the household who had shown her genuine care. But she hesitated, uncertain what Greta could realistically do to prevent whatever Edmund might be planning, and unwilling to burden the older woman with fears that might prove impossible to act upon. Instead, she carried the weight alone once more, watching Edmund with increasing wariness, cataloging his moods and movements with the vigilance of a creature sensing a predator's approach. The following weeks brought little relief. More creditors visited, though none with quite the same aggressive force as the first group, and Edmund's business, such as it remained, continued its slow collapse. He sold pieces of furniture quietly, replaced fine silverware with cheaper substitutes, and the house itself began to take on an air of genteel decay, as though the walls themselves sensed the disintegration happening within them. Alara noticed these small changes with the sharp attention of someone whose survival increasingly depended on understanding every shift in her circumstances. Greta, too, sensed the growing danger, though she remained uncertain of its exact shape. She began, in quiet moments, teaching Alara additional practical skills beyond cooking and mending, showing her how to start a fire without matches using flint and dry tinder, how to identify which wild plants might provide sustenance if food ever grew scarce, how to read direction from the position of the sun and stars. Alara absorbed these lessons with grim determination, sensing without being told explicitly that Greta feared for her safety in ways the older woman could not fully articulate. "I do not know what your stepfather intends," Greta told her one evening, her voice low and serious, in a way that underscored the gravity of her words. "But I have seen enough of the world to know that desperate men sometimes make choices that harm those closest to them, simply because those closest to them are the easiest targets for whatever solution presents itself. I want you prepared, Alara, for whatever may come." Alara nodded solemnly, grateful beyond words for Greta's foresight and care, even as fear settled more deeply into her bones with each passing day. She began keeping a small bundle of essential items hidden beneath her bed: a warm scarf, a bit of dried bread wrapped carefully in cloth, a small knife Greta had quietly given her for practical purposes, though neither of them spoke aloud the darker reasons such preparation might prove necessary. It was during this period of mounting tension that Edmund announced, with little warning and even less explanation, that he would be taking Alara on a journey to visit a distant relative, a cousin of her late mother's, who lived several days' travel to the north. He offered no details about who this relative was or why such a visit had suddenly become necessary, and something in his manner, a forced casualness that failed to mask an underlying tension, sent immediate alarm bells ringing through Alara's already anxious mind. "When do we leave?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral, despite the fear churning in her stomach. "3 days from now," Edmund replied, not quite meeting her eyes. "Pack only what is necessary. We will not be gone long." Alara retreated to her room that evening, with her mind racing through every possible implication of this sudden announcement. She had no memory of any cousin of her mother's living to the north, had never heard Miriam mention such a relative during all their years together. The explanation felt hollow, constructed rather than genuine, and combined with the conversations she had overheard about guardianship and obligations, she found herself increasingly certain that this journey was not what it appeared to be on the surface. She sought out Greta immediately, finding the older woman in the kitchen, and shared her fears in a low, urgent whisper. Greta's expression darkened as she listened, her hands stilling their work as the full weight of the situation settled over them both. "I do not like this," Greta said finally. "I do not like this at all, but I fear there is little I can do to prevent it, given his legal authority over you. All I can offer is this," and she pressed a small pouch into Alara's hands, containing a few precious coins she had saved over the years, along with a folded piece of paper bearing an address. "This is my sister's home, several days' journey east of here. If ever you find yourself in genuine danger, and if you are able, make your way there. She will take you in, I promise you that much." Alara clutched the pouch tightly, tears welling in her eyes as she embraced Greta fiercely, both of them understanding without words that this moment might well be their final farewell, that whatever journey lay ahead might separate them permanently, and that the fragile safety Alara had found within these walls was about to be tested in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. That night, Alara packed her small bundle beneath the watchful eye of a waning moon, preparing herself as best she could for a journey she increasingly suspected would end not with reunion, but with abandonment. The 2 days that remained before their departure passed with an agonizing slowness that Alara had never before experienced. She moved through the house like a girl already half gone, memorizing details she feared she might never see again: the particular slant of afternoon light through the kitchen window, the worn groove in the staircase banister where countless hands had rested before hers, the faint scent of dried lavender that still lingered in her mother's abandoned sewing room. Every ordinary corner of the house took on a strange, aching significance, as though her body understood, before her mind fully accepted, that she was preparing to leave behind everything familiar. Edmund, for his part, grew increasingly withdrawn as the day of departure approached, spending long hours locked in his study, emerging only for brief, silent meals, during which he barely acknowledged her presence at the table. Alara studied him carefully during these encounters, searching his face for any sign of what truly lay ahead, but found only the same guarded blankness that had become his customary expression toward her since her mother's death. She wondered, in her more desperate moments, whether some part of him felt guilt over whatever he was planning, or whether guilt was simply an emotion he had long since abandoned in favor of pure self-preservation. Greta used these final days to impart whatever additional wisdom she could, walking with Alara through the frozen garden despite the biting cold, pointing out landmarks and directions, drilling her on the location of Greta's sister's home, until Alara could recite the route from memory without hesitation. She also taught her a few careful phrases to use if she ever needed to appeal to a stranger for help, how to present herself as a lost traveler rather than a runaway, how to avoid drawing suspicion while still communicating genuine need. "You must trust your instincts," Greta told her during one such walk, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "If a situation feels wrong, it likely is wrong. Do not wait for certainty before acting to protect yourself. By the time certainty arrives, it is often too late." Alara absorbed these words with the solemn attention of someone who understood, perhaps more deeply than any child should have to, that her survival might soon depend entirely on her own judgment and resourcefulness. She practiced, in the privacy of her room, imagining various scenarios and how she might respond to each, rehearsing courage she did not entirely feel, but hoped desperately she might summon, if the moment demanded it. On the evening before their departure, Alara found herself unable to sleep, her mind cycling endlessly through fears and possibilities. She rose quietly from her bed and made her way down to the kitchen, hoping perhaps for a cup of warm milk to ease her restlessness, and found Greta still awake, sitting near the dying embers of the hearth fire, her expression heavy with worry she had clearly been trying to hide during the daylight hours. "You should be asleep," Greta said gently, though she made no move to send the girl away, instead patting the bench beside her in silent invitation. Alara sat, drawing her knees up to her chest, staring into the glowing coals. "I am frightened," she admitted quietly, the words feeling strange and vulnerable in the quiet darkness of the kitchen. "I do not know what awaits me on this journey, and I fear the worst, though I cannot say precisely what form that worst might take." Greta wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close in a gesture that offered more comfort than words ever could. "Fear is not weakness, child. It is simply your mind preparing you for difficulty ahead. What matters is that you do not let it paralyze you when action is needed. Whatever happens tomorrow, and in the days that follow, remember that you carry your mother's strength within you, and my teachings, and whatever wisdom you have gathered through all you have already endured. You are more capable than you know." They sat together in silence for a long while after that, the fire slowly dying down to embers, until finally Greta insisted Alara return to bed, promising that whatever the morning brought, she would do everything within her limited power to ensure the girl's safety. Alara returned to her room feeling marginally comforted, though sleep continued to elude her for hours afterward, her mind restless with anticipation and dread in equal measure. Morning arrived far too quickly, gray and overcast, with a bitter wind that rattled the shutters and promised harsher weather to come. Alara dressed carefully in her warmest clothing, tucking Greta's small pouch of coins and the folded address deep into an inner pocket where it would not be easily discovered, and made her way downstairs to find Edmund already waiting by the front door, a small travel bag at his feet, and an expression of grim determination on his face that did nothing to ease her mounting anxiety. Greta appeared briefly to see them off, her farewell to Alara lingering just long enough to convey everything words could not adequately express. A fierce embrace, a whispered blessing, a final meaningful glance that promised remembrance and hope even in the face of uncertain danger. Then Edmund was ushering Alara toward the waiting carriage, his hand firm on her shoulder, in a grip that felt less like guidance and more like control. And within minutes, the house that had been her home for so many years, through both joy and increasing sorrow, disappeared behind them, as the carriage rattled down the frozen road, carrying Alara toward a fate she could only imagine, with growing dread, and toward a truth about her stepfather's intentions that she would not have to wait long to discover. The carriage rattled along roads that grew increasingly unfamiliar with each passing hour. Alara sat rigid on the hard seat, watching the landscape shift from the gentle farmland surrounding their town, to denser forest, and then to open, windswept country she had never traveled through before. Edmund said almost nothing during those first hours, staring out his own window with an expression so distant that Alara began to wonder if he had forgotten her presence entirely. She had memorized, as best she could from Greta's careful instructions, the general direction their journey should take, if they were truly heading toward a relative living to the north. But as the hours passed, she noticed with growing alarm that the sun, when it occasionally broke through the heavy clouds, seemed to indicate they were traveling in a direction slightly different from what she had expected, angling more toward the east than the straight northern path Edmund had described before their departure. "Are we still heading toward your cousin's home?" Alara asked carefully, keeping her voice light despite the unease, coiling tighter in her stomach with every passing mile. Edmund's eyes flickered toward her briefly, before returning to the window. "The road curves in places," he said, his tone clipped and discouraging further questions. "Do not concern yourself with matters of direction. Simply rest. We have a long journey ahead." Alara subsided into silence, though her mind continued working furiously behind her outwardly calm expression, cataloging every landmark they passed, every fork in the road they took, building a mental map of their route in case she later needed to find her way back, or, worse, needed to navigate onward alone. The carriage driver, a taciturn man named Silas, who Edmund had hired specifically for this journey, rather than using their usual driver, offered no conversation and seemed entirely focused on managing the horses through the increasingly rough terrain. They stopped briefly at midday at a small roadside inn, where Edmund purchased simple food for them both, bread and cheese and weak tea, that did little to warm Alara against the increasing cold. She studied her stepfather closely during this brief respite, searching for any sign of his true intentions, but found only the same guarded, distracted expression that had characterized his behavior throughout the morning. He spoke briefly with the innkeeper, his voice too low for Alara to catch more than fragments, something about distances and the condition of roads further along their route, before ushering her back into the carriage with a curtness that left little room for lingering questions. The afternoon brought increasingly harsh weather, gray skies darkening further, and a wind that seemed to seep through even the carriage's thick walls, carrying with it the unmistakable bite of an approaching storm. Alara wrapped her thin coat more tightly around herself, watching the barren landscape roll past the window, farmhouses growing sparser, forests thicker and more foreboding, the entire world around them taking on an increasingly desolate quality that matched the growing dread settling into her chest. She thought often, during those long silent hours, of Greta's parting words, of her mother's final admonition about inner strength, of the small pouch of coins hidden carefully in her inner pocket. She found herself running through possible scenarios in her mind, trying to prepare for whatever might come, though she struggled to imagine precisely what form her stepfather's plans might take. Perhaps he truly was delivering her to some distant relative who simply lived further away than expected. Perhaps the tension in his manner stemmed purely from financial worries, unrelated to her fate specifically. She tried, without much success, to convince herself of these more hopeful possibilities, but the accumulated weight of everything she had overheard in recent weeks made such comforting fictions difficult to sustain. As dusk began to settle over the landscape, casting long shadows across the increasingly rugged terrain, Alara noticed Edmund growing more restless, checking the darkening sky repeatedly, exchanging brief, tense words with Silas through the small window that connected the carriage interior to the driver's seat. She caught fragments of their conversation, references to a particular stretch of road, to timing, to the importance of reaching a certain point before full darkness fell. "How much further until we stop for the night?" Alara asked, hoping the ordinary question might yield some useful information about their intended destination. "Not much further," Edmund replied, his voice carrying a strange tightness that immediately heightened her alarm. "We will stop soon enough." The carriage continued onward, as the last vestiges of daylight faded from the sky, the road growing rougher and less traveled, flanked increasingly by dense forest that pressed close on either side, blocking any view of surrounding farmhouses or villages that might otherwise have offered some reassurance of civilization nearby. Alara's earlier attempts at maintaining calm began to fray as genuine fear took hold, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of her seat, watching Edmund's increasingly agitated movements with mounting alarm. Finally, as full darkness settled over the landscape, and a light snow began to fall, dusting the carriage windows with delicate white flakes. Edmund rapped sharply on the roof, signaling Silas to bring the carriage to a halt. Ilara's heart began to pound furiously as the vehicle slowed and finally stopped on what appeared to be an entirely deserted stretch of road, forest looming dark and silent on either side, no lights or signs of habitation visible anywhere in the gathering gloom. "Why are we stopping here?" Ilara asked, her voice barely steady, despite her efforts to control it. Edmund did not answer immediately. He simply stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light filtering through the carriage window, and something in that silence, in the careful blankness he had cultivated toward her for so many months, finally cracked to reveal something far colder and more frightening underneath. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the false warmth he had occasionally managed during earlier, better days. "Get out of the carriage, Ilara." The words landed like physical blows, and for a moment, Ilara simply stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing, though some deep instinctive part of her had been expecting exactly this moment since the very beginning of their journey. "Why? We are in the middle of nowhere. There is no house, no light, nothing." "Get out," Edmund repeated, his voice hardening further, any pretense of civility now entirely abandoned. "I have made arrangements. This is where our journey together ends." Ilara felt her entire body go cold, colder even than the biting wind seeping through the carriage door, as Edmund reached across and pushed it open himself, the frigid night air rushing in to fill the small space between them. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Please do not leave me here. I have nowhere to go, no one to help me. Please." But Edmund's face had hardened into something entirely unmoved by her pleading. A man who had clearly rehearsed this moment in his mind, many times over the preceding weeks, steeling himself against whatever guilt or hesitation might otherwise have given him pause. "You will manage," he said flatly. "Children are more resilient than people believe. Someone will find you along this road eventually. I am certain of it." He gestured sharply toward the open door, and when Ilara did not move quickly enough to satisfy him, he took hold of her arm and guided her firmly out of the carriage himself, setting her down on the frozen roadside with a finality that left no room for further argument or appeal. Ilara stumbled slightly on the icy ground, catching herself against the rough bark of a nearby tree, and turned back toward the carriage, just in time to see Edmund's face disappearing behind the closing door, his expression already shifting away from her, as though she had already ceased to exist in whatever calculations occupied his mind. "Please," she called out one final time, running a few desperate steps toward the carriage, as Silas cracked the reins, and the horses lurched forward. "Please, don't leave me here, please." But the carriage was already moving, gaining speed quickly along the frozen road, its lanterns swaying and casting long, distorted shadows across the snow-dusted path, before disappearing entirely around a distant bend, swallowed by darkness and falling snow, leaving Ilara utterly alone on a deserted road in the depths of a bitter winter night, with nothing but a small bundle of belongings and a pouch of coins to protect her against whatever dangers the darkness might hold. For several long moments, Ilara simply stood frozen where she had stumbled, staring at the empty road where the carriage had vanished, her mind refusing to fully accept what had just happened. Surely, some part of her insisted desperately, this was a mistake, a temporary stop that Edmund would soon reconsider, a moment of harsh words that would give way to remorse and a return of the carriage to collect her from this desolate spot. But as the minutes stretched onward and no sound of returning wheels reached her ears, only the whisper of wind through bare branches and the soft patter of falling snow, the terrible finality of her situation began to settle over her with crushing weight. She turned in a slow circle, taking stock of her surroundings with the methodical attention Greta had taught her, searching for any sign of shelter or habitation nearby. Dense forest rose on both sides of the narrow road, dark and forbidding in the moonless night, offering little comfort despite the potential protection its cover might provide from the worst of the wind. The road itself stretched away in both directions, disappearing into darkness, with no visible lights or structures suggesting nearby villages or farmhouses where she might seek help. Her breath came in ragged gasps that formed small clouds in the frigid air, and she forced herself to steady her breathing, remembering Greta's calm instruction that panic would serve her far less well than clear thinking. She reached into her inner pocket, and confirmed the presence of the small pouch of coins and the folded address. Small comforts that reminded her she was not entirely without resources, even if those resources felt woefully inadequate against the vastness of the dark, cold landscape surrounding her. She began walking, choosing the direction that felt, based on her memory of the carriage's earlier turns, more likely to lead eventually toward some form of civilization, rather than deeper into unfamiliar wilderness. The road beneath her feet was hard-packed and treacherously icy in patches, and she moved carefully, mindful of Greta's warnings about the dangers of falling in such bitter cold, where even a minor injury might prove far more dangerous than it would in gentler weather. The first half hour of walking brought little comfort. The cold seemed to seep through her clothing regardless of how tightly she wrapped her coat around herself, and her breath continued forming small clouds that dissipated quickly into the darkness. She kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, searching desperately for any sign of light or habitation, any indication that her situation might soon improve, but found only more darkness, more silent forest, more of the same desolate emptiness stretching endlessly before her. She thought, as she walked, of her mother, wondering what Miriam would think if she could see her daughter now, abandoned on a frozen road by the very man Miriam had trusted to protect her family. The thought brought fresh tears to her eyes, though she quickly wiped them away, aware that tears would only make the cold feel sharper against her already numbing cheeks. She thought too of Greta, of her careful instructions and quiet wisdom, and found some small measure of strength in remembering the older woman's steady confidence that Alara possessed more resilience than she herself believed. As she continued walking, the snow began falling more heavily, thick flakes swirling in the darkness and settling on her shoulders and hair, making the already difficult footing even more treacherous. She stumbled once on a hidden patch of ice, catching herself against a low stone wall that ran alongside a portion of the road, and paused there for a moment to catch her breath, her hands scraped raw from the impact against the rough stone. It was during this brief pause that she first noticed how quickly her body was beginning to lose warmth, despite her continued movement. Her fingers, even tucked into the sleeves of her coat, had grown stiff and difficult to move, and her feet, clad in boots that had seemed adequate for ordinary winter days, but proved woefully insufficient against the bitter cold of a night spent entirely exposed to the elements, felt increasingly numb with each passing step. She pressed onward regardless, understanding on some deep instinctive level that stopping for too long in such conditions might prove far more dangerous than the discomfort of continued movement. She began humming softly under her breath, one of the old tunes her mother used to sing, finding some small comfort in the familiar melody, even as her voice trembled with cold and exhaustion. The road continued its lonely path through the dark forest, occasionally curving alongside the edge of a frozen stream, whose surface glinted faintly under the scattered moonlight that occasionally broke through the heavy cloud cover. Alara followed these small landmarks with growing desperation, hoping each curve might reveal some sign of nearby habitation, but each turn brought only more of the same empty, frozen landscape stretching before her. As the hours passed and her strength continued to ebb, Alara's thoughts grew increasingly fragmented, her mind struggling against the creeping fog of cold-induced exhaustion that Greta had once warned her about during one of their many lessons by the kitchen fire. She remembered, though the memory felt distant and disconnected now, Greta's careful explanation of how bitter cold could confuse the mind, making a person feel warm even as their body grew dangerously chilled, a false comfort that had claimed the lives of careless travelers throughout the ages. Recognizing the danger in this creeping confusion, Alara forced herself to focus on small, concrete tasks, counting her steps, naming the different types of trees she could identify even in the darkness, anything to keep her mind sharp and alert against the seductive pull of exhausted surrender. She thought of the small knife Greta had given her, tucked safely in her bundle, though she could not imagine what use it might serve against the true enemy she now faced, an enemy made not of human malice, but of cold, indifferent nature itself. The forest around her seemed to grow denser and darker with each passing mile, the road narrowing slightly as it wound deeper into what felt like increasingly remote countryside. Alara began to wonder, with mounting despair, whether she had chosen the wrong direction entirely, whether her earlier calculations about the carriage's route had led her astray, sending her deeper into wilderness rather than toward whatever distant village or farmhouse might offer salvation from the bitter cold slowly claiming her strength. She pressed on nonetheless, driven by a stubborn determination that felt less like conscious choice, and more like some deep, instinctive refusal to simply stop and accept whatever fate awaited her on this lonely road. Her mother's final words echoed in her mind, with increasing insistence, as her physical strength waned, a mantra she repeated silently, with each labored step. You are stronger than you know. You are stronger than you know. You are stronger than you know. The snow fell more steadily now, coating the road in a thin white blanket that made each step increasingly treacherous. Ilara's pace had slowed considerably from the brisk determination of her first hour walking, her legs growing heavier with each stride, her thoughts beginning to blur at the edges, in ways that frightened her, even as she struggled to maintain clarity. She stopped counting her steps somewhere along the way, no longer trusting her own numbers, and instead focused simply on placing one foot in front of the other, a single small task that felt increasingly monumental as her strength continued to fade. She came upon a fallen log at one point, half buried in drifting snow, and sat upon it briefly to rest her aching legs, immediately regretting the decision, as the cold radiating up through the frozen wood seemed to seep directly into her bones. She forced herself upright again quickly, remembering Greta's warnings about the danger of resting too long in such conditions, though the pull toward simply closing her eyes and surrendering to exhaustion grew stronger with each passing minute. The road had narrowed considerably by this point, the forest pressing close on either side, branches heavy with snow occasionally creaking and shifting in the bitter wind. Ilara's earlier fear of wild animals or unseen dangers lurking in the darkness had faded, replaced by a more immediate and pressing terror, the growing realization that her body was failing her, that the numbness spreading through her fingers and toes represented something far more serious than simple discomfort. She tried to remember everything Greta had taught her about surviving extreme cold, searching her memory for any useful piece of wisdom that might help her now. Keep moving, she remembered, though her legs felt increasingly reluctant to obey this simple instruction. Avoid resting for too long. Watch for signs of confusion or unusual warmth, for these signal the body's dangerous surrender to cold rather than any genuine improvement in condition, she noted, with a distant kind of alarm that felt strangely disconnected from her actual physical sensations, that she had indeed begun to feel a peculiar warmth spreading through her limbs, despite the bitter temperature surrounding her. Precisely the false comfort Greta had warned, represented mortal danger rather than relief. Fighting against the growing urge to simply stop and rest, to allow the strange warmth to carry her into whatever peaceful oblivion it promised, Ilara forced herself to continue walking, though her steps had grown unsteady, occasionally stumbling over patches of ice or hidden roots beneath the snow. She began talking to herself softly, a habit she had never before indulged, but which now seemed to provide some small anchor against the growing fog clouding her thoughts. Just a little further, she whispered, her voice barely audible even to her own ears, muffled by the falling snow and her own increasingly labored breathing. Just a little further, and there will be a house, or a village, or someone who can help. But no house appeared. No distant lights broke through the darkness ahead, only more empty roads stretching endlessly into the swirling snow, more silent forest pressing close on either side, more of the same bitter cold that had already claimed so much of her strength and threatened now to claim far more. She thought of her mother, of Greta, of the small pouch of coins that now felt utterly useless against the true danger she faced, a danger that no amount of money could resolve. Her legs finally gave way entirely near a small stone marker at the edge of the road, some ancient boundary post whose purpose she could not guess, its surface worn smooth by countless years of weather. She sank down beside it, telling herself she would rest for only a moment, only long enough to gather her strength before continuing onward, though some deeper part of her recognized the danger in this rationalization, even as she succumbed to it. The cold stone against her back felt, in her increasingly confused state, almost comforting, a solid presence against the swirling white chaos of the falling snow. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them in a futile attempt to preserve whatever warmth remained in her small body, and closed her eyes against the relentless snow, telling herself she would rise again in just a moment, just one more moment of rest, before continuing her desperate journey toward safety. Her thoughts drifted, in this state of exhausted half-consciousness, toward memories that felt both vivid and strangely distant, her mother's face illuminated by candlelight as she read old stories aloud, Greta's steady hands kneading bread dough in the warm kitchen, the particular scent of roses from her mother's garden during the height of summer. These memories felt more real to her now than the bitter cold surrounding her, more real than the increasingly faint awareness of her own physical body slowly succumbing to the winter night. She was not entirely certain how much time passed, as she sat huddled against the stone marker, her thoughts drifting increasingly toward disconnected fragments of memory and half-formed dreams. She was aware, in some distant corner of her consciousness, that this drifting represented danger, that Greta had warned her explicitly against exactly this kind of surrender to the cold's false comfort. But the warning felt increasingly difficult to hold on to, slipping away like water through cupped hands no matter how desperately she tried to grasp it. At some point, she became aware of a strange stillness settling over her, a quiet that felt different from the earlier silence of the empty road, deeper somehow, more complete. The falling snow seemed to soften every sound, wrapping the world in a hush that felt almost peaceful, despite the desperate circumstances that had brought her to this moment. She thought, in her increasingly fragmented awareness, that perhaps this peace represented some form of acceptance, a quiet surrender to whatever fate the frozen road had prepared for her, and she found, to her own distant surprise, that she felt less fear in this moment than she had throughout the entirety of her long walk, as though her mind had finally exhausted its capacity for terror, and settled instead into something resembling calm resignation. She thought once more of her mother's final words, though they felt increasingly distant now, fragments of meaning slipping away, like the last light fading from a winter sky. "You are stronger than you know." She wanted to believe this, wanted to summon whatever strength remained within her to rise once more and continue walking. But her body no longer seemed to respond to her mind's increasingly faint commands, and the growing warmth spreading through her limbs, false though she knew it to be, felt increasingly difficult to resist. The snow continued falling steadily around her small, still form, gradually softening the outline of her huddled figure against the ancient stone marker, until she became little more than a pale shape, barely distinguishable from the surrounding white landscape, a small light flickering ever more faintly against the vast and indifferent darkness of the winter night. With no one aware of her plight, no one searching for her along this lonely stretch of forgotten road, and no sign whatsoever that rescue might arrive before the cold claimed the very last of her fading strength. Somewhere in the depths of her fading awareness, Alara's mind continued to drift through fragments of memory, disconnected and increasingly dreamlike. She recalled a summer afternoon years earlier, before her father's death, when she had run through fields of tall grass, while Henry Whitmore called after her with warm laughter, urging her to slow down before she tumbled into the nearby stream. She recalled the particular texture of her mother's hands, softened with lavender oil, brushing through her hair each evening before bed. She recalled Greta's steady voice, reciting old stories of clever foxes, finding their way home through impossible odds, and some distant part of her wondered whether she too might find such a path, even now, even here. The cold no longer felt as sharp as it once had, a fact that some small, still alert corner of her mind recognized as deeply troubling rather than reassuring. She had heard once, perhaps from Greta, or perhaps from some half-remembered story, that the body sometimes played cruel tricks in its final struggle against extreme cold, convincing its owner of warmth and safety, precisely when danger had grown most acute. She wanted to fight against this deception, wanted to force her eyes open and her legs to move, but the effort required felt increasingly beyond her diminishing reserves of strength. Her breathing had grown shallow and slow, each exhale forming a smaller cloud in the frigid air than the one before it. And though she remained dimly aware of this change, she found it increasingly difficult to summon any appropriate alarm in response. The snow continued to fall, gentle and relentless, settling across her shoulders and the crown of her dark hair, blurring the edges of her small form against the pale stone marker, until she resembled something more akin to a drift of snow herself than a living child in mortal danger. Time seemed to stretch and compress strangely in her fading consciousness, moments feeling both impossibly long and impossibly brief, until she could no longer clearly distinguish how long she had sat huddled in this position, whether minutes or hours had passed since her legs first gave way beneath her. She thought, in one of her last clear moments of awareness, that she should perhaps try once more to rise, to continue her desperate search for shelter or rescue. But the thought arrived and departed, without any accompanying will to act upon it, her body having apparently surrendered whatever authority her mind still nominally held. The forest around her remained utterly silent, save for the whisper of falling snow and the occasional distant creak of ice-laden branches shifting in the wind. No animal calls broke the stillness. No distant sound of human activity offered any hint that help might be near. The isolation felt complete, absolute, as though she had wandered beyond the edges of the known world into some forgotten wilderness where no rescue could possibly find her in time. And yet, even as her conscious thoughts grew increasingly fragmented and her body settled further into dangerous stillness, some deep and stubborn part of her, perhaps the very strength her mother had spoken of in her final days, refused entirely to accept defeat. It manifested not as any dramatic surge of physical energy, for her body remained largely unresponsive to such demands, but as a quiet, persistent thread of awareness that continued, faintly, to hope, to wait, to hold on against odds that grew more impossible with each passing minute. It was this thread, thin as it had become, that kept some small flicker of consciousness alive within her, even as the cold continued its relentless work, even as the snow continued to fall and gather across her still form, even as the long winter night stretched onward with no sign whatsoever of the rescue she so desperately needed, and could not have known, in her fading awareness, was drawing steadily closer along that same lonely road. Duke Nathaniel Ashworth had traveled this particular stretch of northern road many times before, always in daylight, always with the comfortable certainty of a man whose journeys followed predictable patterns of business and duty. Tonight, however, circumstances had conspired to delay him well past his intended schedule, a lengthy meeting with regional officials regarding boundary disputes having stretched far longer than anticipated, leaving him traveling through unfamiliar darkness on a road he normally would have crossed hours earlier, under the safety of daylight. His carriage, finely appointed though built for practicality as much as comfort, moved steadily through the falling snow, drawn by 4 sturdy horses guided by his longtime driver, a capable and weathered man named Tobias, who had served the Ashworth family for over 2 decades. Inside, the Duke sat wrapped in a heavy fur-lined coat, reviewing correspondence by the light of a small lantern, his mind still occupied with the tedious details of the boundary negotiations that had consumed his entire day. Nathaniel was a man in his mid-30s, tall and solidly built, with the kind of quiet authority that came from a lifetime of responsibility, rather than mere inherited privilege. He had inherited his title young, following his father's unexpected death, and had spent the years since, working diligently to prove himself worthy of the position, earning a reputation among both his peers and his tenants as a fair and thoughtful leader, uncommonly attentive to the welfare of those under his protection. He had no wife, no children of his own, his personal life having remained largely secondary to the demands of managing his extensive estates and responsibilities, though he had never quite abandoned hope that circumstances might someday allow for a fuller personal existence beyond duty alone. The snow had been falling steadily for the better part of an hour, thick flakes swirling in the lantern light that flickered against the carriage windows, and Nathaniel found himself glancing up periodically from his papers to assess the worsening conditions outside. He called up to Tobias through the small window connecting the carriage interior to the driver's seat, inquiring about the state of the road ahead. "Rough going, my lord," Tobias called back, his voice slightly strained against the wind. "But the horses are managing well enough. We should reach the crossroads within the hour, provided the snow does not worsen further." Nathaniel nodded, though Tobias could not see the gesture, and returned his attention to his papers, though his concentration had begun to fray under the combined weight of exhaustion and the growing discomfort of travel through such harsh conditions. He found himself, in these quiet moments, thinking of his warm study back at the estate, of the fire that would be waiting there, of the simple comfort of finally concluding a long and difficult day. It was perhaps 20 minutes later, as the carriage rounded a gentle curve in the road flanked by dense forest on either side, that Tobias called out sharply, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately drew Nathaniel's full attention away from his papers. "My lord, there is something ahead, by the old boundary stone. I cannot quite make it out through the snow." Nathaniel leaned toward the window, peering out into the swirling darkness, and caught only a brief glimpse of something pale against the stone marker, before the carriage's motion obscured his view once more. His instinct, Born of years managing an estate where unexpected obstacles on remote roads often meant nothing more than fallen branches or wandering livestock, was to instruct Tobias to simply continue past whatever minor obstruction lay ahead. But something about the shape he had glimpsed, small and unnaturally still against the pale stone, nagged at him with an insistence he could not immediately dismiss. "Slow the horses," he called up to Tobias. "I want a closer look." Tobias complied, easing the horses to a slower pace as they drew nearer to the boundary marker, and as the carriage's own lanterns swung into range, illuminating the huddled shape more clearly. Nathaniel felt his entire body go rigid with sudden alarm. It was a child, small and impossibly still, curled against the base of the stone marker, her dark hair and thin coat already dusted thickly with accumulated snow, no movement whatsoever visible in her huddled form. "Stop the carriage," Nathaniel commanded, already reaching for the door, before Tobias had fully brought the horses to a halt. "Stop immediately." He threw open the carriage door before the vehicle had entirely stopped moving, ignoring Tobias's alarmed protest about the danger of exiting too quickly, and half stumbled, half ran through the accumulating snow toward the small figure slumped against the ancient stone. His heart pounded with a fear entirely different from any he had experienced in years, a visceral, immediate dread that arrived before conscious thought could fully catch up to the scene unfolding before him. "Great heavens," he murmured, dropping to his knees beside the child, his gloved hands reaching to gently touch her shoulder. Her skin, what little was visible beneath her thin, snow-dusted coat, felt alarmingly cold, even through the thick fabric of his glove, and her stillness sent a fresh wave of panic through his chest. "Child, can you hear me? Can you open your eyes?" There was no response, no flicker of movement to suggest she had heard his words at all, and Nathaniel felt a fear more acute than any political crisis or a state emergency had ever provoked in him. He pressed his fingers carefully against the side of her neck, searching desperately for any sign of a pulse, and after several agonizing seconds during which his own heart seemed to stop entirely in dreadful anticipation, he felt it, faint and fluttering but undeniably present, a small, stubborn heartbeat continuing its work against overwhelming odds. "She is alive," he called back toward the carriage, his voice tight with urgency. "Tobias, bring blankets, quickly, and clear space inside the carriage. We must get her warm immediately, or we will lose her before we can reach any proper help." Tobias scrambled down from his seat with a speed remarkable for a man of his years, retrieving the heavy wool blankets kept in the carriage for emergencies, while Nathaniel carefully gathered the small, alarmingly light form into his arms, cradling her against his chest in an attempt to share whatever warmth his own body might offer against the bitter cold that had already claimed so much of hers. Her head lolled against his shoulder, utterly unresponsive, and he found himself murmuring low, urgent reassurances as he carried her toward the carriage, words he was not entirely certain she could hear, but which felt necessary to speak regardless. "Hold on," he whispered, settling her as gently as possible onto the carriage seat, while Tobias hurriedly wrapped the thick blankets around her small, shivering form, tucking them close against every possible gap where cold air might penetrate. "Hold on, little one. You are safe now. Whatever brought you to this terrible place, you are safe now, I promise you that." Nathaniel climbed into the carriage beside her, settling her carefully against his side to share what warmth he could offer, while calling up urgent instructions to Tobias regarding their destination. "The Crossroads Inn is too far and too poorly equipped for what she needs. We return to the estate immediately, as fast as the horses can safely manage. Send word ahead, if any messenger can reach faster than we can travel, that Dr. Whitfield should be summoned without delay." Tobias immediately turned the carriage, urging the horses into a pace considerably faster than the careful progress they had maintained through the worsening snow, while Nathaniel held the small, unresponsive child close against him, monitoring her shallow breathing, with an anxious attention he had rarely devoted to anything in his adult life. He found himself, in the tense minutes that followed, praying with a fervor he had not summoned since his own father's sudden death years earlier, praying that whatever fragile thread of life remained in this small, mysterious child would hold on long enough for proper help to arrive. As the carriage rattled onward through the darkness and falling snow, carrying them both away from the lonely boundary stone and toward whatever uncertain outcome awaited at the Ashworth estate, Nathaniel found his thoughts turning to questions he could not yet answer. Who was this child, and how had she come to be abandoned on such a remote and dangerous stretch of road, in such bitter weather? with no visible protector or companion anywhere in sight. What circumstances could possibly explain such a cruel abandonment, and what would he find, once she recovered enough to speak, about the events that had led her to this terrible fate? These questions would have to wait, he reminded himself firmly, setting aside speculation in favor of the more immediate and pressing task of keeping this fragile, unknown child alive through whatever remained of this bitter winter night. The Ashworth estate came into view sooner than Nathaniel had dared hope, its windows glowing warmly through the falling snow, like a beacon promising salvation. Tobias had pushed the horses to their limits, and as the carriage swept up the long drive toward the main entrance, Nathaniel called out urgent instructions to the household staff, who emerged in response to the commotion, their faces registering shock at the sight of their usually composed employer cradling an unconscious child against his chest. "Fetch every blanket in the house," he commanded, carrying the small girl through the grand entrance hall, with a speed that left snow tracking across the polished floors behind him. "Warm water, not too hot, mind you, and someone ride immediately for Dr. Whitfield. Tell him it is a matter of life and death, and I will not accept any delay in his arrival." The household staff, long accustomed to their duke's occasional unpredictable demands, but rarely witnessing such open urgency in his manner, scrambled to comply with impressive efficiency. Nathaniel carried Alara directly to a guest room near his own quarters, one kept perpetually ready despite rarely receiving visitors, and laid her carefully upon the bed, while housemaids rushed to build up the fire and gather the requested supplies. Mrs. Pemberton, the estate's longtime housekeeper, arrived within minutes, her practical composure a welcome steadying presence amid the chaos. She had raised several children of her own before entering service, and her experienced eyes immediately assessed the girl's condition with a critical thoroughness that Nathaniel found himself grateful for, given his own inexperience with matters of childhood illness or injury. "We must remove these wet clothes immediately, Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said briskly, already working at the fastenings of Alara's snow-soaked coat. "And we need warm blankets, not hot, mind you. Gradual warming is essential. Sudden heat can prove dangerous to a body chilled this severely." Nathaniel stepped back to allow Mrs. Pemberton and two housemaids to work, pacing anxiously near the doorway as they carefully removed Alara's damp clothing and wrapped her in dry, warmed blankets, positioning her close enough to the newly built fire to benefit from its warmth without excessive proximity that might cause harm to her already compromised condition. He watched with a helpless kind of anguish he had rarely experienced, this powerful man, accustomed to solving problems through decisive action, now reduced to simply waiting, hoping, praying, that their efforts would prove sufficient against whatever damage the bitter cold had already inflicted. Dr. Aldous Fenwick, the same physician who had attended Miriam during her final illness, though Nathaniel had no way of knowing this connection, arrived considerably faster than anyone had anticipated, having been summoned from a nearby village where he had been tending another patient when the Duke's messenger found him. He entered the room with brisk professional efficiency, immediately setting to work examining Alara's condition, checking her pulse, her breathing, the color and temperature of her skin, his expression grave but not entirely without hope as he worked. "She is severely chilled," Dr. Fenwick said finally, straightening from his examination and addressing Nathaniel directly. "Her body temperature has dropped dangerously low, and I detect early signs of frost affecting her fingers and toes, though I believe, with proper care, we may prevent any lasting damage. The critical hours are these next several, Your Grace. We must warm her gradually, monitor her breathing closely, and hope her body finds the strength to recover on its own, for there is little more medicine alone can accomplish in cases such as this." Nathaniel nodded gravely, absorbing this information with the same intensity he brought to any crucial matter affecting his estate or his people, though this situation felt different, more personal somehow, in ways he did not entirely understand, given that he had known this child for scarcely an hour. "What can I do?" he asked. "Whatever is needed, spare no expense, no effort." "Warm broths, when she is able to take them," Dr. Fenwick instructed. "Continue gentle warmth, though we must avoid overheating her too quickly. And patience, Your Grace. The body heals at its own pace in matters such as this, and there is little we can do beyond providing the proper conditions and waiting for her own strength to assert itself." The hours that followed passed with an agonizing slowness that tested Nathaniel's considerable patience more thoroughly than any political negotiation, or estate crisis he had previously encountered. He remained near the guest room throughout the night, alternately pacing the corridor outside and sitting in a chair near the door, unwilling to fully retreat to his own quarters, despite Mrs. Pemberton's gentle suggestions that he might benefit from rest himself. Sometime past midnight, as the snow finally began to ease outside the frosted windows, Dr. Fenwick emerged from the room, with news that brought the first genuine relief Nathaniel had felt since discovering the child on that lonely roadside. Her breathing has steadied, and her temperature, while still concerning, has begun to rise toward safer levels. I believe, Your Grace, that the immediate danger has passed, though full recovery will require considerable time and continued careful attention. Nathaniel felt something in his chest loosen slightly at these words, a tension he had not fully recognized until its partial release. May I see her? Briefly, Dr. Fenwick allowed. She remains unconscious, though this is a natural response to what her body has endured, and I expect she will wake within the coming hours, perhaps by morning. Nathaniel entered the room quietly, finding Alara much as she had been throughout the night, small and pale against the pillows, though her breathing now appeared steadier, more natural than the alarming shallow gasps that had characterized her condition when he first discovered her. He settled into the chair beside her bed, studying her face in the flickering firelight, searching for any clue about her identity or circumstances in her unremarkable but delicate features. Her dark hair, now dry and brushed away from her face by one of the housemaid's careful attention, framed features that struck him as unusually composed even in unconsciousness, as though this child had faced hardship before this terrible night, and had learned, somehow, to carry herself with quiet dignity, even through circumstances that would break many adults entirely. He wondered, watching her sleep, what stories lay behind whatever chain of events had led to her abandonment on that remote and dangerous road, and found himself experiencing an unexpected fierce protectiveness toward this small stranger, whose survival had, for reasons he could not entirely articulate, become deeply important to him within the span of a single desperate night. Dawn arrived gradually, gray light filtering through the frost-covered windows as the household began its usual morning routines, though hushed and careful given the unusual circumstances of their unexpected guest. Nathaniel had drifted into a light doze in his chair sometime near daybreak, exhausted despite his determination to remain alert, and it was the soft sound of stirring from the bed that finally roused him fully awake, his eyes immediately snapping toward Alara's face, to find her eyelids fluttering, her expression shifting from the blank stillness of unconsciousness toward something approaching awareness. "There now," he said softly, leaning forward carefully, mindful not to startle her, given her fragile condition. "You are safe. Do not be afraid." Alara's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, taking in her unfamiliar surroundings with evident confusion. The fine furnishings of the guest room, the warm fire crackling in the hearth, the unfamiliar face of the man leaning over her with obvious concern. She struggled briefly to sit up, though weakness immediately forced her back against the pillows, and Nathaniel reached out gently to steady her, his large hand surprisingly careful as it guided her back into a more comfortable position. "Where?" she managed, her voice barely more than a whisper, cracked and hoarse from disuse. "Where am I?" "What happened?" "You are at Ashworth Estate," Nathaniel explained gently, keeping his voice low and reassuring. "I found you on the road last night, nearly frozen. My name is Nathaniel Ashworth. You have been very ill, but Dr. Fenwick assures me you are now recovering. Can you tell me your name, child?" Alara stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through confusion, dawning memory, and finally a fresh wave of tears that spilled down her cheeks, as the events of the previous night came flooding back with painful clarity. "Alara," she finally managed, her voice breaking. "My name is Alara Whitmore." "Alara," Nathaniel repeated gently, committing the name to memory with a solemnity that felt entirely appropriate given the gravity of what she had survived. "You are safe now, Alara. Whatever happened to bring you to that road, you need not fear it any longer. You have my word on that." Alara's tears continued falling, though something in her expression suggested these were not tears purely of fear or grief, but perhaps also the first flickering of relief and disbelief that rescue had truly arrived, that a stranger of such evident kindness and standing had chosen to stop his carriage for a small, abandoned girl on a forgotten stretch of frozen road, when so many others might have simply continued past without a second glance. In the days that followed, Elara's physical strength returned gradually, under the attentive care of Mrs. Pemberton and the household staff. Though the emotional weight of everything she had endured proved considerably slower to heal. She remained largely confined to her bed for the better part of a week, her fingers and toes recovering fully from the early frost that had threatened them, though she experienced occasional lingering numbness that Dr. Fenwick assured her would fade entirely with time and continued care. Nathaniel visited daily, sometimes for only brief periods given the many responsibilities that demanded his attention as Duke, but always with a consistency that gradually helped Elara understand that his kindness, on that first terrible night, had not been some temporary aberration, but rather a genuine reflection of his character. He brought her books to read during her convalescence, arranged for simple, nourishing meals suited to her recovering appetite, and gradually, through patient and gentle questioning, spread across several conversations rather than any single overwhelming interrogation, began to piece together the circumstances that had led to her abandonment. "You need not tell me everything at once," he told her during one such conversation, seated in the chair beside her bed, while afternoon light filtered softly through the window. "But I confess, I am deeply troubled by what happened to you, and I would like to understand, when you feel ready to share it, exactly how you came to be alone on that road." Elara found herself, over the course of these gentle conversations, gradually revealing the full scope of her circumstances: her father's early death, her mother's remarriage to Edmund Voss, the slow deterioration of any warmth or care he had once pretended to feel toward her, her mother's illness and subsequent death, and finally the mounting evidence she had gathered of Edmund's crushing debts and his cold calculation that abandoning her represented the simplest solution to a problem he no longer wished to manage. Nathaniel listened to each revelation with an expression that grew progressively darker, his jaw tightening with barely restrained anger as the full picture of Edmund's cruelty became clear. He was a man who prided himself on maintaining calm, measured responses even to significant provocations, a skill honed through years of managing difficult negotiations and estate disputes. But the deliberate abandonment of a child to nearly certain death tested even his considerable self-control. "This man," he said finally, after Elara had finished describing the moment Edmund pushed open the carriage door and ordered her out into the bitter darkness. "This Edmund Voss, he simply left you there, with no shelter, no means of reaching help, fully expecting that you might not survive the night?" Elara nodded, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap, unable to meet his gaze as she confirmed the terrible truth of her circumstances.
"He said someone might find me eventually. He did not seem to care whether that happened before or after the cold claimed me."
Nathaniel rose from his chair, pacing briefly near the window as he processed this information, his usual composure visibly strained by the depth of anger he clearly felt on her behalf. "Such cruelty demands accountability," he said finally, turning back to face her with an expression of firm resolve. "I intend to see that this man answers for what he has done, both to protect any other unfortunate soul who might otherwise fall prey to his callousness, and to ensure he cannot simply continue his life unaffected by the harm he has caused you." "What will you do?" Elara asked, genuine uncertainty in her voice, having never before experienced anyone with sufficient power or inclination to pursue justice on her behalf. "I will send men to locate him," Nathaniel replied. "Given the route you described, and the timing of your journey, I believe we can trace his movements without excessive difficulty. Once located, he will face formal accusation of abandonment and endangerment, charges that carry serious consequences under the law, particularly given your young age and the deliberate nature of his actions." True to his word, Nathaniel dispatched several trusted men that very afternoon, experienced in matters of investigation and possessing sufficient authority, given their association with the Duke, to make inquiries throughout the region without encountering the kind of resistance or evasion that might otherwise hamper such efforts. He also sent word to the town where Elara had lived, seeking information about Edmund's business affairs, his remaining debts, and the current state of Miriam's former property, determined to fully understand the scope of the situation before taking further action. While these investigations proceeded, Elara continued her recovery, gradually gaining strength, and with it, a cautious sense of hope that had felt entirely foreign to her during the long months preceding her abandonment. Mrs. Pemberton, Initially reserved in her interactions with the mysterious child the Duke had rescued, gradually warmed considerably as she came to understand the depth of hardship Ilara had endured, taking on something of a maternal role that Ilara found herself cautiously accepting after so many months of isolation and uncertainty. "You have been through more than any child should have to bear," Mrs. Pemberton told her one afternoon, helping Ilara braid her hair as they sat together near the fire, a small domestic ritual that felt achingly reminiscent of evenings once spent with her own mother. "But you are safe here, and His Grace is not a man who abandons those under his protection, whatever circumstances brought them there." Ilara found herself, over the following weeks, gradually settling into the rhythms of life at Ashworth Estate, though always with a lingering wariness born of her previous experiences, a reluctance to fully trust that her circumstances had truly changed for the better after so many months of disappointment and betrayal. She watched Nathaniel carefully during their interactions, searching, almost against her own will, for any sign of the coldness or calculation that had characterized Edmund's treatment of her, but found instead only consistent patience, genuine curiosity about her well-being, and a steady kindness that showed no indication of wavering or hidden agenda. It was during this period that Nathaniel's investigators returned with their initial findings, information that painted an increasingly clear picture of Edmund's desperate circumstances and the calculated nature of his decision to abandon Ilara rather than continue supporting her. They had traced his movements to a town several days' journey from where Ilara had been found, discovering that he had indeed continued northward following her abandonment, apparently intending to establish himself in a new location where his substantial debts and damaged reputation might not immediately follow him. "He has been staying at an inn under a different name," one of the investigators reported to Nathaniel, with Ilara present at the Duke's insistence, given that the information directly concerned her own circumstances and future. "Though local inquiries suggest his funds are nearly exhausted, and he has been unable to establish any new business ventures, given his damaged reputation among regional merchants, many of whom have received warnings from his previous creditors regarding his unreliability." Nathaniel absorbed this information with a grim satisfaction that suggested his sense of justice remained firmly engaged despite the passage of time since Ilara's rescue. "Good," he said finally. "A man who abandons a child to the mercy of winter weather should not find easy refuge from the consequences of such cruelty. I want him located precisely, and I want formal charges prepared. Charges that will ensure he faces proper accountability under the law, and that Ilara's future remains fully protected from any further claim he might attempt to assert." Ilara listened to this exchange with a complicated mixture of emotions, relief at the prospect of justice finally being pursued on her behalf, but also a lingering unease at the thought of confronting Edmund again, even indirectly through legal proceedings, given the deep and lasting fear his cruelty had instilled in her over the preceding months. Nathaniel, perhaps sensing her discomfort, turned to address her directly, his expression softening from the hard resolve he had shown moments earlier. "You need not fear any of this," he assured her. "You will not be required to face him directly if you do not wish to. My role, and the role of the legal authorities we will engage, is precisely to shield you from any further harm while ensuring proper consequences follow his actions. Your only task now is to continue your recovery, and to begin, when you feel ready, considering what future you might wish to build from here forward." Ilara found herself, hearing these words, experiencing something she had not felt in longer than she could clearly remember. A genuine sense that her well-being mattered to someone with the power and inclination to actually protect it, rather than the hollow promises and calculated kindnesses she had grown accustomed to expecting from the adults in her life. She did not yet know what shape her future might ultimately take, but for the first time since her mother's death, she found herself daring to hope that it might hold something better than the fear and uncertainty that had defined her recent months. The formal proceedings against Edmund Voss began roughly a month after Ilara's rescue, once Nathaniel's investigators had gathered sufficient evidence and located him definitively in a small northern town where he had been attempting, with little success, to rebuild some semblance of his former business. The local magistrate, informed of the Duke's direct interest in the matter and the serious nature of the charges involved, moved with unusual speed to bring Edmund before a formal hearing. Ilara was not required to attend this hearing herself, as Nathaniel had promised, though she waited anxiously at the estate for news of its outcome. seated near the window of the study Nathaniel had begun allowing her to use for reading during her recovery. Mrs. Pemberton kept her company throughout the long afternoon, offering quiet reassurance as they both awaited word from the town where the proceedings were taking place. When Nathaniel finally returned that evening, his expression carried the particular satisfaction of a man who had witnessed justice properly served, though tempered with the gravity appropriate to the serious matter at hand. He found Alara still seated near the window, having abandoned any pretense of reading in favor of anxious waiting, and settled into the chair across from her with the deliberate care of someone about to share significant news. "It is done," he said simply. "Edmund Voss has been formally charged with child abandonment and endangerment, charges that carry serious legal consequences given the deliberate nature of his actions and the clear evidence of his intent. Evidence that included testimony from the innkeeper where you stopped that day, who recalled his strange manner and evasive answers regarding your destination, as well as documentation of his substantial debts and his prior conversations with his lawyer regarding guardianship arrangements." Alara absorbed this information slowly, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease that she struggled to fully articulate, even to herself. "What will happen to him?" "He will face imprisonment," Nathaniel replied. "The length determined by the magistrate, based on the severity of his crime, though given the circumstances, I expect a substantial sentence. More immediately relevant to your own future, however, is that his guardianship over you has been formally revoked, and any remaining claim he might have held over your mother's estate has been forfeit, given the criminal nature of his conduct." This last piece of information struck Alara with particular force. The realization that whatever thin legal connection had bound her to Edmund's household, whatever vestigial claim he might have maintained over her future, had now been entirely severed. She felt, hearing this news, a weight lifting from her chest that she had not fully recognized carrying, until its absence became so suddenly apparent. "What happens to me now?" she asked, the question carrying more vulnerability than she had intended to reveal, though something in Nathaniel's steady, patient manner throughout her recovery had gradually eroded her instinct to guard her emotions so carefully in his presence. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful as he seemed to consider his response with considerable care. "That," he said finally, "depends significantly on what you yourself wish for your future. Alara, you are without immediate family, given your mother's death and your father's earlier passing, and the legal authorities have indicated that formal guardianship arrangements will need to be established, given your young age. I have given this matter considerable thought in recent weeks, and I would like to propose an arrangement, though I want to be entirely clear that you are free to consider alternatives if this does not suit you." Alara felt her heart quicken slightly, uncertain what proposal might follow, but sensing, from the careful gravity of his tone, that whatever he intended to suggest carried significant weight for both their futures. "What sort of arrangement?" "I would like to formally assume guardianship over you myself," Nathaniel said, his words measured and deliberate, as though he had rehearsed this proposal carefully, in anticipation of this exact moment. "Not out of mere obligation or pity, but because in the weeks since I found you on that road, I have come to genuinely care for your well-being, and I believe, given proper time and support, you could build a good and stable life here at Ashworth Estate, with access to proper education, comfortable circumstances, and, I hope, the beginnings of genuine family connection that your circumstances have so cruelly denied you these past months." Alara felt tears welling in her eyes at this proposal, an overwhelming mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and cautious hope that she found difficult to immediately process into coherent words. She had spent so many months believing herself entirely unwanted, a burden to be managed or discarded, rather than a child deserving of genuine care, and to hear this powerful, respected man offer not merely temporary shelter, but permanent family connection, felt almost too significant to fully absorb in a single moment. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally, her voice thick with emotion. "You barely know me. I am no relation to you, no obligation you carry beyond simple chance and circumstance." Nathaniel's expression softened further at this question, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but entirely sincere. "Sometimes, Alara, the connections that matter most are not those we are born into, but those we choose, or that circumstance places before us in ways we could never have anticipated. I found you on that road, through nothing more than fortunate timing, and perhaps a small measure of instinct that told me to stop rather than continue past. But in the weeks since, watching your resilience, your quiet strength, despite everything you have endured, I have come to believe that whatever brought us together that night was no mere accident, but rather the beginning of something meaningful for us both. I have long felt the absence of family in my own life, given my father's death and my own unmarried status, and I find myself, perhaps unexpectedly, deeply wishing to provide you the stable and loving home you deserve, while also finding in your presence something I did not realize I had been missing from my own life. Alara sat with these words for a long moment, feeling their weight and sincerity settle over her, with a warmth that felt entirely different from the calculated kindness Edmund had once performed for her mother's benefit. She thought of her own mother's final words, her insistence that Alara carried more strength within her than she recognized, and wondered whether some part of her mother's hope for her future had somehow found its way toward fulfillment through this unexpected turn of events. "I would like that," she said finally, her voice steadying as conviction grew within her. "I would like very much to stay here, if you truly wish it." Nathaniel's expression broke into a genuine smile, the first she had seen from him that carried such unguarded warmth, and he reached across the small distance between their chairs to gently squeeze her hand. "Then it is settled. We will begin the formal legal arrangements immediately, and Alara, I want you to know that whatever fears or uncertainties linger from your previous experiences, you need not carry them here. This is your home now, for as long as you wish it to be, and I intend to ensure you never again face the kind of abandonment and cruelty that brought us together on that terrible night." In the days that followed this conversation, Mrs. Pemberton and the household staff began preparing more permanent arrangements for Alara's presence at the estate, converting a spacious room near Nathaniel's own quarters into a proper bedroom suited to a young girl's needs and preferences, rather than the temporary guest arrangements that had served during her initial recovery. Alara found herself, during this period, gradually allowing herself to imagine a future that felt genuinely hopeful, a stability and warmth she had believed lost forever, following her mother's death and Edmund's subsequent cruelty. She thought often of Greta during these weeks, wondering how the older woman fared, and whether news of Edmund's fate and Alara's rescue had somehow reached her. Nathaniel, learning of this concern, arranged for a message to be sent to Greta directly, informing her of Alara's survival and current circumstances, an act of kindness that brought Alara to tears when he informed her of what he had done. "You need not have done that," she told him, though her gratitude was evident in every word. "Kindness given to you deserves to be returned wherever possible," Nathaniel replied simply. "This Greta sounds as though she cared for you deeply during difficult times, and she deserves to know that her care was not in vain, that you survived, and now find yourself in circumstances that honor the strength she helped instill in you." Greta's reply arrived within the fortnight, a letter written in careful, deliberate handwriting that Alara recognized immediately, having watched the older woman practice her letters by candlelight on more than one quiet evening back at the old house. The letter itself was brief, for Greta had never been a woman inclined toward excessive words, but every line carried a depth of relief and gratitude that brought fresh tears to Alara's eyes as she read it aloud to Nathaniel in the study. "She writes that she feared the worst," Alara said, her voice thick with emotion as she scanned the careful script. "She says she prayed every night since we parted, and that this news has lifted a weight from her heart she feared she might carry forever." Nathaniel listened with quiet attention, and when Alara finished reading, he suggested, with a gentleness that had become characteristic of him, that perhaps Greta might be invited to visit the estate in person, rather than continuing their reunion through letters alone. Alara's face lit with an eagerness she made no effort to hide, and within weeks, the arrangements were made for Greta's journey to Ashworth Estate, a reunion that Alara anticipated with a mixture of joy and lingering disbelief that such kindness could continue accumulating after so many months of hardship. The days leading up to the formal legal proceedings that would finalize Nathaniel's guardianship also brought other visitors to the estate, officials whose task it was to verify the circumstances of Alara's situation and ensure that proper legal safeguards accompanied such an unusual arrangement between a duke and a child with no prior family connection to him. Nathaniel handled these proceedings with his characteristic thoroughness, ensuring every document was properly prepared, every question from the visiting magistrate answered with complete transparency regarding his intentions and the circumstances that had brought Alara into his care. "It is not common," the magistrate observed during one such visit, reviewing the paperwork spread across Nathaniel's desk, "for a man of your position to seek guardianship over a child with no blood connection or prior acquaintance. I must ask, Your Grace, what assurance can you offer regarding your long-term intentions toward this arrangement?" Nathaniel answered without hesitation, his tone carrying the same steady conviction that had characterized every decision he had made since that first night on the frozen road. "My intention is simple and enduring. This child was failed catastrophically by the one adult legally bound to protect her, and I found myself, through circumstances neither planned nor anticipated, in a position to offer her the protection and care she deserved, and had been so cruelly denied. I intend to raise her as my own, to provide for her education, her well-being, and her future, for as long as she wishes to remain under my care, and I have already begun the process of formally securing her inheritance rights and future prospects through proper legal channels, independent of any other considerations regarding my own estate or title." The magistrate seemed satisfied by this response, particularly given the thorough documentation Nathaniel had already prepared, and the guardianship proceedings concluded without further complication, formally and legally establishing Alara's place within the Ashworth household in a manner that could not easily be challenged or reversed by any future claim from Edmund or other distant relations who might otherwise have contested the arrangement. Alara, present for portions of these proceedings at Nathaniel's insistence that she understand fully the nature of her new circumstances, found herself experiencing a peculiar mixture of emotions as she watched adults discuss her future with such careful formality. She had spent so many months feeling as though her fate rested entirely in the hands of others who cared little for her actual well-being, and to now witness such deliberate, careful attention, devoted specifically to securing her safety and future prospects, felt almost surreal in its contrast to everything she had previously known. "Do you understand what all this means?" Nathaniel asked her gently, once the magistrate had departed, and the formal documents had been properly filed and witnessed. "It means I am truly safe now," Alara replied, her voice carrying a quiet wonder that had not fully left her since her rescue. "Not just for now, but for however long I might need such safety. No one can take that away from me again. No one," Nathaniel confirmed firmly. "This is your home now, Alara, secured not merely by my personal wishes, but by proper legal standing that cannot easily be challenged or undone. Whatever fears linger from your previous circumstances, I hope you can gradually release them, knowing that this security is genuine and lasting." Spring arrived at Ashworth Estate with a gentleness that felt, to Alara, like nature itself offering a quiet blessing over the new life she had begun building in the months since Nathaniel found her on that frozen roadside. The gardens surrounding the main house, tended by a staff of dedicated gardeners under Mrs. Pemberton's careful direction, burst into color with an abundance that reminded Alara, in bittersweet moments, of her mother's own beloved garden, though she found these memories increasingly bringing comfort rather than pure grief as time passed. She had settled fully into her new circumstances by this point, her formal guardianship arrangements completed and legally binding, her days filled with proper education under a carefully selected tutor Nathaniel had engaged specifically for her needs, as well as the simple pleasures of childhood that had been so thoroughly denied her during the difficult months following her mother's death. She rode horses through the estate's extensive grounds, under the patient instruction of one of the stable hands, practiced her needlework alongside Mrs. Pemberton in quiet afternoon sessions that reminded her fondly of her mother's own patient teaching, and gradually rebuilt the kind of easy laughter and genuine joy that had felt entirely foreign to her during the darkest period of her young life. Greta had arrived at the estate some weeks earlier, following an invitation Nathaniel extended, once he learned the full extent of the older woman's care and protection toward Alara during the difficult months preceding her abandonment. Greta had initially hesitated to accept such generous hospitality, uncertain of her place within such a grand household, but Alara's evident joy at their reunion, along with Nathaniel's genuine warmth in welcoming her, had gradually convinced the older woman to remain, taking on a role within the household that honored her long connection to Alara, while also providing her the comfortable retirement she had long deserved after years of faithful service. "I never imagined such an outcome," Greta told Alara one afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, watching bees move lazily between the blooming flowers. When I gave you that address and those coins, I hoped only that you might find some measure of safety, some path toward survival. I never dared imagine you might find something as remarkable as this." Alara smiled, reaching over to squeeze the older woman's weathered hand affectionately. "I would not have survived at all without everything you taught me, Greta. The lessons you gave me, the courage you helped instill, they carried me through that terrible night, even when my own strength began to fail. Whatever good has come since, it began with your care." News of Edmund's fate had reached them formally some weeks earlier, confirmation that he had been sentenced to a substantial term of imprisonment, his remaining assets seized to partially satisfy his outstanding debts, his name thoroughly disgraced throughout the region, given the public nature of his trial, and the widespread condemnation his cruelty had provoked among those who learned of it. Alara found herself experiencing a complicated mixture of emotions upon receiving this news, a lingering echo of the fear he had once instilled in her, but also a growing sense that justice, properly pursued, had finally closed this painful chapter of her life in a manner that allowed her to move forward without constant looking over her shoulder. Nathaniel had proven, in the months since his initial rescue and subsequent proposal of guardianship, to be everything his early kindness had suggested he might be: patient and attentive to her needs, genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, rather than merely tolerating her presence, and consistently demonstrating the kind of steady, reliable care that Alara had once believed existed only in the fondest memories of her father and the earliest, now distant years with her mother. He made time for her despite the considerable demands of managing his extensive estates, often setting aside evening hours specifically to hear about her day, to discuss whatever books she had been reading with her tutor, to simply enjoy her company in ways that felt entirely unforced and genuine. "You seem happy today," Nathaniel observed one such evening, finding her in the study reading quietly by the fire, her expression notably more relaxed and content than the wary, guarded manner that had characterized her earliest weeks at the estate. "I am happy," Alara replied, looking up from her book with a smile that reached fully into her eyes, something Nathaniel had come to treasure witnessing, given how rarely such genuine joy had appeared during her initial recovery. "I did not think, for a long time, that I would feel this way again. I am grateful, more than I know how to properly express, for everything you have done." Nathaniel settled into the chair across from her, his own expression warm with genuine affection that had grown steadily since that first desperate night on the frozen road. "You need not express gratitude constantly, Alara, though I appreciate the sentiment. Having you here has brought me more genuine joy than I anticipated when I first proposed this arrangement. I confess I had grown accustomed to a certain solitude in my personal life, focused entirely on duty and responsibility, and your presence has reminded me of aspects of life I had perhaps too easily set aside in favor of obligation alone." As the months continued to pass, Alara gradually transformed from the frightened, wary child Nathaniel had discovered on that lonely road into a confident, increasingly joyful young girl who moved through the halls of Ashworth Estate with a growing sense of genuine belonging. She formed friendships with children from neighboring estates whom Nathaniel introduced her to during social gatherings, activities that felt entirely foreign to her previous isolated existence, but which she embraced with the eager curiosity of a child finally given permission to simply be young, without the constant burden of fear and calculation that had characterized her earlier circumstances. She thought often, during quiet moments, of her mother, of her father, of the family she had lost through circumstances entirely beyond her control, and though grief remained a constant undercurrent within her, she found it gradually transforming from sharp, overwhelming pain into something softer, a bittersweet remembrance that honored their memory without preventing her from embracing the genuine happiness she had found within her new circumstances. She understood, with a maturity beyond her years, born from everything she had endured, that loving her new life with Nathaniel and Greta did not diminish or betray the love she still carried for her original family, but rather represented exactly the kind of resilience and continued capacity for joy that her mother had always hoped she might discover, even in the aftermath of terrible hardship. One particular evening, nearly a year after Nathaniel first found her on that frozen roadside, Alara stood with him in the estate's garden, watching the sun set in brilliant colors over the distant hills, the same garden that had bloomed so beautifully throughout the spring and summer months since her arrival. She thought back, in this peaceful moment, To the desperate girl who had huddled against that ancient stone marker, believing her story had reached its tragic conclusion, unaware that rescue was drawing steadily closer along that same lonely road. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked Nathaniel quietly, watching the last light fade slowly behind the horizon. "About what might have happened if you had simply continued past, as anyone else might have done given the weather and the late hour?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful as he considered her question with the same careful gravity he brought to any significant matter. "I think of it often," he admitted finally. "Not with regret, for that path was never truly considered, but with a kind of profound gratitude that I happened to be traveling that particular road at that particular hour, and that something within me recognized the importance of stopping rather than continuing onward. I believe, Alara, that some moments in life carry a weight and significance beyond simple chance, and that night was surely one of them, for both of us." Alara nodded, reaching over to take his hand in a gesture that had become natural between them over the months of their growing relationship, no longer merely guardian and ward, but something approaching genuine family, bound not by blood, but by the deeper connection of chosen care and mutual affection. "I am grateful too," she said softly, "more grateful than I can properly express. Whatever hardship brought me to that road, I would not trade the life I have found here for anything, even the chance to undo everything that came before." They stood together in comfortable silence as the last light faded fully from the sky, stars beginning to emerge overhead in the clear evening air, the estate behind them glowing warmly, with lit windows that promised comfort and safety within. Alara thought of Greta, settled comfortably in her new role within the household, of the friendships she had begun forming with neighboring children, of the education and opportunities now available to her that had once felt entirely beyond reach, and of Nathaniel himself, this unexpected guardian whose simple decision to stop his carriage on a snowy night had transformed the entire trajectory of her young life. The road that had once represented abandonment, cruelty, and near certain death had become, through circumstances neither of them could have fully anticipated, the very path that led her toward genuine family and lasting happiness. Alara understood now, with a clarity that only such profound hardship could have taught her, that even the darkest and most desperate moments sometimes carried within them the seeds of unexpected rescue, that kindness could arrive from the most unlikely sources, and that the strength her mother had once promised she carried within herself had indeed proven sufficient to carry her through the coldest night of her life, and into the warmth of a future she could finally, genuinely, call her own.